The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast slate of gray-green water beneath a low ceiling of clouds. February 1942. The war was young, brutal, and unforgiving. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks sat in the left seat of the PBY-5A Catalina, call sign Playmate 2, his hands steady on the yoke as the twin Pratt & Whitney engines droned their monotonous song at 110 knots. The flying boat was graceful in the air, awkward on land, but here, over the open Pacific, it was in its element. Marks was 31 years old, a naval aviator with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor that inspired confidence in his crew. Behind him, 9 men occupied the cramped fuselage of the Catalina: a co-pilot, a navigator, 2 radio men, 2 waist gunners, a bow gunner, a flight engineer, and a rescue swimmer. They had been airborne for nearly 4 hours, searching for survivors from a downed B-17 reported somewhere in this godforsaken expanse of ocean southwest of the Philippines. The war had turned the Pacific into a graveyard. Japanese forces had swept through the region like a tidal wave, and Allied aircraft were being shot down almost daily. The men who survived the crashes faced an enemy even more merciless than enemy fire: the ocean itself. Dehydration, exposure, sharks. Every minute in the water reduced the chances of survival. "Sir, I've got something," called out Ensign Irving, the navigator, his voice crackling over the intercom. "Bearing 270, approximately 3 miles. Marks banked the Catalina gently to the left, descending to 500 feet. The ocean surface came into sharper focus, whitecaps rolling, the water alive with motion. Then he saw them, tiny specks of orange against the gray. Life rafts. At least 3, maybe 4. Men waving frantically. "There they are," Marks said, his voice steady but charged with urgency. "Prepare for low pass. I want a count." The Catalina roared over the rafts at 200 feet. Marks could see them clearly now, survivors in yellow Mae West life vests, some lying motionless, others struggling to sit upright. 8 men. Maybe 9. It was hard to tell. Some were clearly injured. One raft was half deflated, sinking lower with each passing wave. "Jesus Christ," muttered the co-pilot, Lieutenant Gwynn. "They're not gonna last much longer." Marks pulled the Catalina into a wide turn, circling the survivors. His mind raced. Standard procedure was to drop emergency supplies and radio for surface rescue. But the nearest ship was hours away, maybe 6, maybe 8. The sea was getting rougher. The men below didn't have hours. Then it happened. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the fuselage, followed by a violent shudder. The starboard engine coughed, sputtered, and began trailing a thin stream of black smoke. The Catalina lurched to the right. "Starboard engine failure," shouted the flight engineer, his voice tight with alarm. "Oil pressure dropping fast." Marks fought the controls, his feet working the rudder pedals to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The aircraft yawed hard, threatening to spin into a spiral. His hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity. "Feather it. Feather the prop." Marks barked. The flight engineer worked quickly, adjusting levers and switches. The propeller on the starboard engine slowly rotated into alignment with the airflow, reducing drag. The shuddering eased, but the Catalina was now flying on one engine, losing altitude steadily. "Can we make it back to base?" Gwynn asked, his voice edged with fear. Marks scanned the instruments. Altitude, 400 feet and dropping. Airspeed, 95 knots and falling. Engine temperature on the port engine, climbing. The math was brutal and simple. They wouldn't make it. "Negative," Marks said quietly. "We're going down." The crew fell silent. Every man aboard knew what that meant. A water landing in open ocean, in a damaged aircraft, was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation. The Catalina was designed for it, yes, but not with one engine out, not in rough seas, not with a crew already exhausted from hours of searching. Marks looked down at the survivors in the rafts. They were still waving, still hoping. "Get everyone strapped in," Marks ordered, his voice firm and clear. "We're setting her down, and then we're picking those boys up." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, securing equipment, tightening harnesses, bracing for impact. Marks lined up the Catalina parallel to the swells, watching the rhythm of the waves. Too steep an angle and the nose would dig in. Too shallow and they'd skip and cartwheel. The margin for error was razor-thin. The altimeter unwound. 300 feet. 200 feet. 100 feet. The ocean rushed up to meet them. Brace! 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 The Catalina hit the water like a sledgehammer striking concrete. The impact slammed every man against his restraints with bone-jarring force. Metal groaned and buckled. Rivets shrieked under stress. Water exploded over the cockpit windows in a blinding wall of white foam. For a moment, the world was chaos. Noise, motion, spray, and the terrifying sensation of the aircraft being swallowed whole by the ocean. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The Catalina bobbed violently on the surface, rocking side to side as waves hammered the hull. Water poured through a dozen new seams and cracks in the fuselage. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt spray filled the cabin. "Sound off!" Marks shouted, shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision. One by one, the crew called out. Bruised, shaken, but alive. No major injuries. The aircraft had held together, barely. "Engine status?" Marks demanded. "Both dead, sir," the flight engineer reported. "Port engines seized. We're on battery power only." "Hull integrity?" "We're taking on water. Pumps are running, but we've got cracks in at least 3 compartments. We can stay afloat, but not for long." Marks unstrapped and made his way aft, bracing himself against the violent rocking. Through the waist gunner's blister window, he could see the life rafts, closer now, maybe a quarter-mile away. The survivors were still there, still waving, still alive. "Get the rescue equipment ready," Marks ordered. "Rafts, lines, medical supplies. We're going to bring them aboard." "Sir," Gwynn said carefully, "if we take on more weight, we might sink faster." Marks turned to face him. His expression was calm, but his eyes were hard as steel. "We didn't crash land in the middle of the Pacific to watch those men die, Lieutenant. We're getting them aboard." "All of them?" Gwynn nodded. "Yes, sir." The crew moved quickly, deploying the Catalina's own emergency rafts and attaching tow lines. 2 men, aviation machinists Mate Second Class Johnson and Seaman Phillips, volunteered to swim out to the survivors and bring them back. They stripped off their flight suits, pulled on life vests, and slipped into the cold water without hesitation. The sea was rougher than it had looked from the air. Swells rolled 4 to 6 feet high, and the current pulled hard. Johnson and Phillips swam with strong, steady strokes, dragging a rope behind them. It took them nearly 20 minutes to reach the first raft. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The B-17 crew had been in the water for more than 15 hours. Their lips were cracked and bleeding from salt exposure. Their skin was pale and wrinkled. 2 men were unconscious, barely breathing. One had a compound fracture in his leg, the bone visible through torn flesh. Another was delirious, mumbling incoherently about fire and falling. "We got you, buddy," Johnson said, gripping the first man under the arms. "We got you. You're gonna be okay." One by one, they brought the survivors back to the Catalina. The crew hauled them aboard through the waist blister, laying them out on the deck of the fuselage. The medic worked frantically, splinting the broken leg, administering morphine, wrapping burns, forcing water down parched throats. 8 men. All accounted for. All alive. But the Catalina was sinking. Water was now ankle-deep in the main compartment and rising. The pumps screamed, struggling to keep up. The aircraft wallowed lower in the water with each passing minute. Marks knew they had bought time, but not much. "Radio?" he called out. "Dead, sir," the radio man replied grimly. "Antennas torn off. We've got no transmission capability." Marks clenched his jaw. They were alone. Adrift. In the middle of the Pacific. With 8 injured men aboard and a sinking aircraft. The sun was beginning to set, painting the horizon in shades of blood orange and deep purple. The temperature was dropping. Night in the open ocean was a different kind of hell, cold, dark, and infested with predators. "Keep the pumps running," Marks ordered. "Ration the water. And keep watch. If a ship comes, we need to be ready to signal." "And if no ship comes?" Gwyn asked quietly. Marks looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean. The waves rolled on, endless and uncaring. "Then we hold on," he said. "And we survive." The crew settled in for a long night. They took turns manning the pumps, watching for sharks, and tending to the injured. The B-17 survivors lay in makeshift bedding, some sleeping fitfully, others staring at the ceiling of the fuselage with hollow eyes. The Catalina rocked and groaned, a dying whale struggling to stay afloat. Hours passed. The stars came out, cold and distant. The ocean whispered against the hull. And then, just after midnight, someone saw it. "Light!" shouted Phillips from the bow. "I see a light. Bearing 090. Every man who could move scrambled to look. There, on the horizon, was a faint pinprick of white light. A ship. It had to be. "Signal them," Marks barked. "Flares. Now." The crew fired 3 flares into the night sky. Brilliant red stars arced upward, illuminating the ocean in a hellish glow before falling back into the water. The light on the horizon changed course. It was coming toward them. For the first time in hours, Adrian Marks allowed himself to hope. The light grew brighter, closer, taking shape against the darkness. It was a ship, no question now. The crew of the Catalina watched in tense silence as the vessel approached, cutting through the swells with the purposeful grace of a predator. "It's a destroyer," Gwyn said, squinting through the darkness. "Can't make out the markings yet." "Please be ours," muttered Johnson. "Please be ours." The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. The Pacific was crawling with Japanese warships. If that destroyer wasn't American, they were all dead, or worse, prisoners. The crew checked their sidearms instinctively, though everyone knew small arms would be useless against a warship. Then, through the darkness, a signal lamp blinked. Morse code. The radio man, who could read the flashing light, called out the letters as they came. USS. CECIL. JOHNSON. A cheer erupted from the crew. American. A Fletcher-class destroyer. Salvation. But the relief was short-lived. The Catalina lurched suddenly, the bow dipping lower. Water was now knee-deep in the fuselage, pouring in faster than the failing pumps could handle. The aircraft was dying beneath them. The destroyer slowed as it approached, engines reversing to kill its forward momentum. Even in the darkness, Marks could see the silhouette clearly now, sleek, deadly, bristling with guns and depth charges. The Cecil Johnson came alongside at a distance of about 50 yards, close enough to communicate but far enough to avoid collision in the heavy seas. A voice boomed across the water through a megaphone. "Catalina, this is Commander Harrison, captain of the USS Cecil Johnson. What is your status?" Marks cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back. "We have 10 crew and 8 survivors aboard. Aircraft is taking on water. We need immediate evacuation." "Understood. Stand by for rescue operations." The destroyer's crew moved with impressive speed. Cargo nets were deployed over the starboard side. A motor whaleboat was lowered into the water, manned by 4 sailors and a coxswain. The small boat's engine sputtered to life, and it began making its way toward the sinking Catalina, pitching wildly in the swells. "Get the injured ready to move," Marks ordered. Priority to the B, 17 survivors. The crew worked quickly, fashioning slings and harnesses from rope and life vests. The unconscious men were the hardest, dead weight, difficult to maneuver through the narrow hatches. Johnson and Phillips positioned themselves in the water again, ready to help transfer men from the Catalina to the whaleboat. The first survivor was a tail gunner from the B-17, a kid named Martinez who couldn't have been more than 20. His leg was splinted and wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. 2 men lowered him carefully through the waist blister into the arms of the sailors in the whaleboat. "Easy. Watch his leg." "I got him," Martinez groaned as he was laid into the bottom of the boat, but he was alive. 1 down. 17 to go. The whaleboat made its first run to the destroyer, transferred Martinez and 2 others, then returned. The process was agonizingly slow. Each transfer took precious minutes, and the Catalina was sinking faster now. The water was waist-deep in the fuselage. Equipment floated past: maps, empty ammunition cans, a torn flight jacket. The Catalina's tail was noticeably lower, the nose rising at an angle. The aircraft was beginning its final plunge. "Faster," Marks urged. "We don't have much time." The second whaleboat run took 4 more survivors. The third took 3. Only 8 men remained aboard the Catalina: Marks, Gwynn, 2 other crew members, and 4 survivors who were still conscious and could move under their own power. Then disaster struck. A swell larger than the others rolled under the Catalina. The aircraft lurched violently to port. Metal shrieked. Something in the hull gave way with a sharp crack. Water surged into the fuselage in a torrent, rising from waist to chest in seconds. "She's going," someone screamed. "Abandon aircraft." "No." "Everyone out." Panic threatened to take hold, but Marks's voice cut through it like a blade. "Stay calm. Get to the rafts. Move." The crew scrambled through the hatches, pulling the remaining survivors with them. They tumbled into the water, gasping at the cold, clinging to life vests and debris. The whaleboat surged forward, sailors reaching out to haul men aboard. Marks was the last to leave. He stood in the rapidly flooding cockpit, looking around one final time. The Catalina had saved them all. Now she was dying. "Thank you, old girl," he whispered. He climbed out through the cockpit hatch just as the water reached his chest. The aircraft shuddered beneath him, groaning like a dying whale. He dove into the water and swam hard toward the whaleboat. Behind him, the Catalina's tail slipped beneath the surface. The nose rose higher, pointing toward the stars. For a moment it hung there, suspended between sea and sky. Then, with a final mournful sigh of escaping air, the Catalina slid beneath the waves and disappeared into the black depths. 20 men bobbed in the water, clinging to rafts and debris. The whaleboat made 2 more runs, ferrying everyone to the destroyer. Cargo nets were thrown down, and hands reached out, strong hands pulling them up, hauling them to safety. Marks climbed the net last, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. At the top, a sailor grabbed his arm and pulled him over the rail onto the deck. "Welcome aboard, sir," the sailor said with a grin. "Hell of a landing you made out there." Marks collapsed onto the deck, chest heaving, staring up at the stars. Around him, his crew and the survivors lay scattered, wrapped in blankets, drinking water, alive. All of them. Every single one. Commander Harrison approached and extended his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Marks, I presume?" Marks took the hand and shook it weakly. "Yes, sir." "You just pulled off one of the gutsiest water landings I've ever heard of. And you saved 18 lives doing it. Marks looked around at the faces of his crew and the men they'd rescued. Exhausted, injured, but alive. "We did what we had to do, sir," Marks said quietly. "That's all." The USS Cecil Johnson cut through the dark Pacific waters at 20 knots, heading northeast toward the nearest Allied base at Ulithi Atoll. Below decks, the ship's sickbay had been transformed into a makeshift emergency room. The destroyer's chief medical officer, Lieutenant Brennan, moved between the injured with practiced efficiency, assisted by 2 pharmacists' mates and several volunteers from the crew. Adrian Marks sat on a crate outside the sickbay, still dripping seawater, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His flight suit clung to his skin, cold and uncomfortable, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, back on the Catalina, replaying the landing, the rescue, the final moments before she went down. Commander Harrison found him there 20 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Marks and sat down beside him. "How are your men?" Harrison asked. "Alive," Marks replied, the word carrying more weight than it should. "All of them. Bruised, exhausted, but alive." "And the B-17 crew?" "Martinez is in rough shape. Compound fracture, infection setting in. Brennan thinks he'll lose the leg, but he'll live. The others are dehydrated, hypothermic, traumatized. But they'll make it." Harrison sipped his coffee, nodding slowly. "You know what you did out there, don't you?" Marks didn't respond immediately. He stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid slosh with the motion of the ship. "I crashed a perfectly good aircraft," Marks said finally. "Cost the Navy a PBY." Harrison laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Cost the Navy a PBY? Son, you landed a crippled flying boat in open ocean, rescued 8 men from certain death, kept everyone alive until help arrived, and didn't lose a single soul in the process. You didn't crash anything. You pulled off a goddamn miracle." Marks looked up, meeting the commander's eyes. "It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like the only option." Harrison studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's what makes it courage. Not the absence of fear, but doing what has to be done anyway." The conversation was interrupted by a shout from the bridge. "Captain!" Radio message coming in. Harrison stood, drained his coffee, and clapped Marks on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Lieutenant Commander. You've earned it." But Marks didn't rest. He couldn't. Instead, he made his way through the ship, checking on his crew one by one. He found Gwyn in the crew quarters, writing a letter to his wife. Johnson and Phillips were in the mess, wolfing down hot food with the hollow-eyed intensity of men who'd stared death in the face. The radio man was asleep in a hammock, snoring softly. The others were scattered throughout the ship, processing what they'd been through in their own ways. He saved the B-17 survivors for last. They were gathered in a corner of the sickbay, those who could sit upright propped against the bulkhead. Martinez lay on a table, sedated, his shattered leg immobilized in a splint. The others watched Marks approach with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that looked like awe. A bombardier named Kelly spoke first, his voice raspy from dehydration. "You're the pilot, the one who landed the Catalina." Marks nodded. "That's right. We thought we were dead," Kelly continued. "We'd been in the water since yesterday morning. 2 of our guys didn't make it, went down with the plane. We figured we'd be next. And then you showed up." "And then you crashed," added another survivor, a waist gunner named Thomas. "You crashed your own plane to save us." Marks shifted uncomfortably. "We had engine failure. We didn't have a choice." "Bullshit," Thomas said, but there was no anger in his voice. Only respect. "You had a choice. You could have dropped supplies and flown back on one engine. You could have radioed for surface rescue and left us to wait. But you didn't. You brought that bird down, knowing you might not walk away, because you knew we wouldn't last until help arrived." The sickbay fell silent. Even the pharmacist's mate had stopped working, listening. Marks didn't know what to say. He'd done what any pilot would do, what any decent human being would do. At least, that's what he told himself. "Thank you," Kelly said quietly. "For our lives." Marks swallowed hard, nodded, and left the sickbay before the emotion could overwhelm him. 3 days later, the USS Cecil Johnson arrived at Ulithi. The wounded were transferred to a hospital ship. The B-17 survivors were debriefed, treated, and eventually sent back to the States for recovery. Martinez lost his leg below the knee but survived. He would live to see his grandchildren. Adrian Marks and his crew were also debriefed. The report of the incident made its way up the chain of command, where it was read with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. A Catalina deliberately crash-landed in open ocean to effect an at-sea rescue. No fatalities. All survivors recovered. It was unprecedented. Marks was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. His crew received commendations. The story spread through the Pacific Fleet, becoming legend, the pilot who risked everything to save men he'd never met. But Marks himself rarely spoke of it. When pressed by reporters or fellow officers, he would only say, "We did our job. That's all." Years later, long after the war had ended, Adrian Marks would sit with his grandchildren and tell them stories of flying. He would describe the grace of the Catalina, the vastness of the Pacific, the camaraderie of his crew. But he rarely mentioned the landing, the rescue, the night in the water. When his grandson, a curious boy of 10, asked him why, Marks thought for a long time before answering. "Because," he said finally, "some things aren't about the glory. They're about the moment when you look another man in the eye and realize his life is in your hands. And you decide, right then and there, that you'll do whatever it takes to bring him home. That's not heroism. That's just being human." The boy didn't fully understand. But someday Marks knew he would. The Pacific Ocean is vast. It holds countless stories, some recorded, some lost forever to the depths. The Catalina that Adrian Marks flew into the water that day in February 1942 is still down there, somewhere, resting on the ocean floor. The salt and pressure have long since claimed her, reducing her to scattered wreckage and fading paint. But the men she saved lived. They returned to their families, raised children, built lives. Martinez became a teacher. Kelly ran a hardware store. Thomas worked construction and coached Little League baseball. And every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, those who survived would raise a glass, to the Catalina, to the crew, and to the pilot who gave up his aircraft so they could go home. Because in the end, that's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear. Not the lack of doubt, but the willingness to act, even when the cost is high, even when the odds are impossible, because another human being's life depends on it. That is the legacy of the crippled Catalina. That is the legacy of the men who flew her. And that is a legacy worth remembering.